In the second part of this lecture, we already looked at the criticisms of modernization and growth theories, both the criticisms from within, but perhaps more importantly, the criticisms that looked at the fundamental weaknesses of this perspective, and therefore sometimes they're called the radical perspectives. So in this final part of the lecture, we will be looking precisely at those perspectives. The first one being the Marxist or neo-Marxist and dependency approaches, which emphasize the historical and structural conditions of development and underdevelopment, and therefore in a way was a radical perspective. But there is also another perspective which might call radical in a very different way, because it was critical not just of the liberal modernization perspectives, but you might say, or critical even of the Marxist perspectives. And this would be what is known as the counterpoint or the eco-development perspectives. And then finally, to conclude this lecture, let me just look at the perspectives that have come more recently from Pope Francis himself, because he does talk about integral human development and integral ecology, which even though you might consider to be more spiritual or theological perspectives, are actually development perspectives that are interventions in this development debate. So let's start with Marxism, neo-Marxism, and dependency approaches. Now, Marxist theory is very much known as a theory of capitalist development. So it looked at the development and transformation of modes of production from, in many ways, traditional modes of production all the way to feudal, to capitalist, to socialist modes of production. But the perspective of Marxism was really looking at it also from the perspective of the advanced countries. What happens when capital develops, of course, develops in a way that was highly unequal. But then later on, there would be the question of what happens when capitalism begins to move out of its domestic barriers and moves on to new areas, or what we now call today the third world, or the South. In fact, it's true that Marxism focused mainly on the advanced countries and the development of capitalism in those countries. So it took the neo-Marxists and the dependency analysts who looked at the question of what are the effects of capitalism on the periphery. And therefore, from a perspective on the theory of capitalism or the development of capitalism, it becomes a theory of imperialism, the stage of capitalism where capital moves out from the barriers of the advanced countries into the countries which are not yet developed, or the new areas, and therefore also what would be the effects on them. Now, the neo-Marxists and the dependency writers, in a sense, were distinctive also, coming from Hirschman's framework, because they precisely said that you could not just look at the experiences of the center. Because part of the assumption, I guess, in mainstream Marxism, that what happened in the advanced countries, or the now capitalist countries, would also happen in the third world countries. But precisely the neo-Marxists began arguing that this also is a mono-economics claim, precisely because of the distinctiveness of the experiences of the third world or the periphery. And therefore, we have to look at the effects of colonialism and neo-colonialism on the periphery. Now, in their criticism of modernization theory, they would say that the problems of underdevelopment are not just even problems of structural bottlenecks in supply or the lack of productive capacity, or even declining terms of trade. What is important is to understand the periphery in the context of the broader world system. And therefore, you cannot understand what happens in the periphery unless you also understand what has happened in the center. And therefore, what has happened in the periphery in terms of underdevelopment or lack of development is also because they are integrated in this larger world system. So in that sense, neo-Marxists would be critical of the Marxist assumption that even though capitalist development was brutal, it was progressive. So in many ways, they were arguing that in many ways, it was regressive, in fact, and was producing inequalities, not just domestically, but even internationally. Now, this sort of perspective later on came under attack. It came under attack not just from mainstream perspectives, but even from classical Marxists themselves, who began saying that the problem with this approach was that it was a very economistic approach, or a very functionalist or deterministic approach. Because if the perspective is the world system, and the world system was creating underdevelopment, so how do you break out of this world system? So the problem began to be one of a question of how do you move out of this? So is there a possibility of delinking from this world system? And they began arguing, is this a Marxist perspective at all? Or is it a perspective that was really more compatible with nationalism, if they were thinking of an independent path of development for the third world? So many Marxists began saying that this was not a rigorous kind of perspective in terms of Marxist theory. But the answer that was given to those who were more sympathetic to this view was that what it lacked in rigor, it made up for in terms of vigor. Now, what was important was that you needed also to look at what were the possibilities for an alternative development strategy. And some were saying that this was not providing a viable alternative. It was powerful as a criticism of capitalist development and the effects of imperialism, but it did not really provide an alternative vision of development. And therefore, in that sense, it was providing a much more total view, which led to pessimism. So is the answer revolution? But short of revolution, how do you promote development? Now, the implications of this kind of analysis on the political economic approaches would be very important. Because even though you might say this is political economic in perspective, in a sense, by emphasizing the economic factors of the world system, of capitalism internationally, it did not really give too much room for political analysis. So the question was, what is the role of the political in this process? What is the role of the state? Is it possible, for example, to create room for maneuver so that, in fact, countries in the third world or the South will be able to maneuver and promote development even in the context of this world system? Is there a variety of types of regimes politically? And by looking at different types of institutions and relations among political actors that can make possible different types of development. So therefore, it began increasingly to be argued that you needed an appreciation of the character of the political, the character of the state, to understand the room for maneuver for countries caught in this kind of a situation. Now, in fact, you could argue that there was and there is a perspective in this kind of tradition, which really did not look at the world simply as something total or simply as a world system. In fact, the argument of the theorists Cardoso and Faleto was that dependency was not really a theory per se, but really a methodology for understanding concrete situations of dependency. Now, it was possible to look at it from a historical and structural perspective, in the sense that there was a world system in which the countries of the periphery are part, not together with the center. But at the same time, it was possible to look at different kinds of regimes within this political system or political economic system, so that it's possible to look at the relationships among different types of political actors and institutions to understand what would be the room for maneuver in this kind of a situation. Now, Cardoso, in a later article, would say that this is, in fact, the challenge of globalization today, because the world system continues. Now, in fact, it continues in many ways in a context in which the market is even more dominant, and in fact, the individualism and consumerism is still very, very prominent in this context. But the challenge is to find out what are the opportunities for democratization, especially in a context where the foundations of democracy are very weak. And secondly, another important challenge is to look at, is it possible to be inserted in this global capitalist system and yet still provide opportunities for development, and particularly for integrating people into the social arena so that you can address the problem of poverty and also address the problem of the marginalized. Now, this brings us to a perspective known as the counterpoint perspective, or the eco-development or sustainable development perspective, which is a term that is used by the development theorist Bjorn Hetne. He says that if you look at both mainstream liberalism but also Marxism, in many ways, the mainstream social sciences, in this case both liberal and Marxist, in many ways understood the historical development of modernity as progress, as material progress. In fact, for Marxists, you might say that they would look at it as brutal, but especially for classical Marxists, it was something that was progressive. Now, the counterpoint perspective always questioned this assumption of development as linear material progress, because it believed that this kind of progress was in many ways destroying society, destroying community, destroying the environment. And therefore, their argument was that development, rather than linear material progress, should be understood in a much more cyclical way, in a sense much more consistent with and respectful of the rhythm of nature and the whole of creation. In this sense, a kind of development which accepts the inner limits of the human person and at the same time the outer limits of nature. This perspective says that both liberal and Marxist perspectives sacrifice the community in favor of the individual or the market in liberal theory, or in favor of the collective or the state. And therefore, what is needed is to look at a perspective that overcame the problem of productionism and consumerism, which tended to destroy the environment and led to unsustainable development. So this kind of a perspective begins to argue that what you need is an approach to development that sees the inherent superiority of more decentralized, small-scale, and participatory processes, which tend to value the community and the environment. To conclude this lecture, let me just point to Pope Francis's more recent reflections and teachings on how to overcome the crisis of the pandemic and also the problems associated with it. Now, he says that the problem with this present pandemic is that we are concerned about an invisible virus, but at the same time, there's something much more visible in terms of virus, and that is the problem of social inequality, but at the same time, the degradation of the environment. So he's saying that in order for us to address this, we should not simply close our eyes to this problem, because we can come out of this even worse than what we are in right now. And therefore, we have to take a look seriously at our present situation and look at the possibilities for development. And he says that perhaps in terms of a perspective, we can draw upon the principles of Catholic social teaching. And in fact, this is drawn from perspectives on integral human development and integral ecology. Now, the term integral human development and integral ecology would tend to emphasize that development is multidimensional. It's not just about the economic, it's also about the political, the social, the cultural, the spiritual, and the ecological. And Pope Francis precisely says that if we draw upon Catholic social teaching, we will be able to respond to the problems not just of the pandemic or the invisible virus, but also the visible virus of social injustice and degradation of the environment. First of all, by emphasizing the dignity of the human person, who is at the same time a very social and relational being. In other words, go beyond the individualism, which has led to consumerism and productionism in both liberal and Marxist theories. He also says that it's important to look at the preferential option for the poor as a principle, which he says that this preferential option is in fact at the center of the gospel. And what is needed is to address poverty, because the problem is that the poor are not at the center of the economy. And therefore, interestingly, he says, and he makes use of a term from structuralist or even from dependency thinking, that we have to bring the periphery into the center, and therefore away from marginalization into the very center of what we do. And he says that it's very, very important to focus on the question of inequality, precisely because we do not see that goods that are on the earth, whether created goods but also natural goods, are those which are really universal. And therefore, what we need to do is to address the need for seeing the world as one in which we are just administrators or stewards. Because sometimes we tend to see ourselves as the masters of this environment, and therefore leading us to destroy this environment. Now he says that it is a perspective that probably should see that resources, and especially private property, are secondary to the needs of the common good. And therefore, what we need to do is to prioritize the interests of the majority rather than the minority. This calls for solidarity. He says, which is not just a sporadic act of generosity, but really is a real attempt to foster interconnectedness. And in the end, you might say that even though Pope Francis is providing us with a theological or spiritual teaching, it is really also an intervention in the development discussion, because he says that development is about communion, because we really are coming from a common origin in God. We have a common home in the planet Earth, and we also have a common destination in Christ.